Well, we're kind of at the end of a series of lessons talking about times when Jesus was disrupted, when he had certain plans and something comes along and wrecks his plans or changes his plans. You know, somebody interrupts him or somebody asks for a favor. A few weeks ago, we talked about a guy who comes and asks Jesus for a favor and to come heal my servant. And Jesus goes right away. And before he even gets to the guy's house, the guy interrupts again and says, no need to come to my house, Jesus. If you'll just say the word, I'm sure it'll be enough. And he's not even in the same place, and Jesus can announce it, and he has authority over things, and he can make things happen. Well, then today, this lesson out of John chapter 11, probably one of the more famous stories about Jesus. You see him get interrupted, kind of like he's talked to. People come and surprise him with something, but in this case, it seems like he's completely in control of the situation. I mean, what looks like a pretty dangerous interruption to his disciples, Jesus seems to be completely in control of. And I kind of wanted to talk about that dynamic just a little bit, you know, because even when Jesus gets interrupted, he's still the Son of God. He's still divine. There's a sense where even in the middle of a chaos, he's still in control because he's God, and how that interacts and how that affects the guys around him who are just like us, you know, just dust and ashes. We're doing the best we can. And I think that's an interesting dynamic to study and to think about. So I wanted to look at that here today and take kind of a close look at that. So you see in John chapter 11, there was a man named Lazarus. And he was sick, and he was from the village of Bethany there, which was, this is the village of Mary and Martha. And we've met Mary and Martha, not so much in the book of John, but in other books. We've met them before, and they're friends of Jesus. And whenever he goes through that part of the world, he tries to stop at their house, and he tries to visit with them, and he tries to connect there with them. And there's a story in Luke where he has a supper with them, and Mary and Martha's real worried about getting everything done, and Mary just wants to listen to Jesus and visit with him, and you kind of get a glimpse of the two sisters and how they operate. And now we read about Lazarus. He's their brother. We really haven't read about him very much before this story, and he's sick. And Mary, later on in John, she's going to be the one. This actually will happen later on, but it's also a famous story where she'll come and anoint Jesus' feet with perfume. It's the same. So it's a family that had bounced off of Jesus quite a bit. He knew him and was close to him, and Lazarus sick. So the sisters send word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. They don't have to say Lazarus. They don't have to say his name. I mean, they just know that if they say that, then Jesus will know who they're talking about, and because he's so close. And when he heard this, Jesus says, this sickness will not end in death. It's for God's glory, so God's Son can be glorified in it. Jesus sees the thing, and it grieves him. We know he's grieved because later on it talks about him crying about the whole situation there. He weeps in the middle of it. So it affects him, but he sees God moving through the end of it. He knows what God's going to do, and it won't end in death. And so he loves them, but he stayed where he was for 2 more days. He stays where he was for 2 more days. And then he says, let's go back to Judea. Well, Rabbi, the other disciples say, a short while ago, the Jews there were trying to stone you. He says, are you sure this is a good idea? So their concern really is not about Lazarus at all. When Jesus hears about Lazarus and doesn't do anything, the other disciples say, yeah, it's smart, Jesus. You're doing the right thing. We go back there, it could be dangerous, it could be high risk. But now Jesus is changing the plan again. So he's kind of interrupting their plans. He says, now we need to go back. Are you sure it's a good idea? And he tells this little bitty parable. It's not a parable. You wouldn't think of it as a parable exactly, but just a couple of verses. He says, aren't there 12 hours of daylight? And anybody who walks in the daytime won't stumble because they can see by the world's light. But when they walk at night, they stumble, for they have no light. And you might hear that and say, okay, Jesus says that doesn't really help me very much. I understand what you're thinking about there. I mean, they're worried about getting killed. And then he tosses out this little parable. And they probably don't understand what he's talking about at all. And I'll admit it's kind of an enigmatic thing for Jesus to toss out there. But the gist of it is we're in the daytime now. As long as God gives us an opportunity, we've got to take advantage of it and use the opportunity. Nighttime will come soon enough when we can't do anything. And whenever that happens, then we'll be stuck. But as long as we have the opportunity, and there's a lesson in this parable that relates to more than just this story. Sometimes we get an opportunity to do some bit of good for God or some bit of good, and we think about how many different ways it could fall apart, and we talk ourselves out of going or participating because of all the risk. And Jesus says, man, as long as the opportunity's there, you just got to seize the moment. You got to seize the moment. As long as you've got breath and life and opportunity, you've got to, there's a whole nother lesson right there. Anyway, he said that. Then he tells them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. I'm going to go wake him up. And the disciples said, well, if he's asleep, I'm sure he'll get better, But Jesus wasn't talking about sleep. Jesus can be this way, like that parable, and then he's here too. He's kind of being a metaphorical there, being a little bit enigmatic. So he's talking about death when he says fall asleep. And later on in the New Testament, when guys like Paul write, they'll use that figure of falling asleep to talk about death. It's not permanent. You close your eyes in this life, but you're going to wake up in heaven. It's not permanent, like the world thinks about death. And so Jesus tells them plainly, he gets rid of all the metaphors, Lazarus is dead. When I said fall asleep, I meant he's dead. But for your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there, so you can believe. So we're going to go and help him out. And Thomas, who's also known as Didymus, which means twin, he says there, well, let's go then, I guess. We'll all just die at the same time. Now you can be kind of hard on Thomas here. Thomas didn't have a lot of faith, and certainly Thomas deserves some of that, but at the same time deserves a little bit of credit. If you really did think you were going to die, if we walk with Jesus here, we're going to die, he's still willing to go. If this is where it's going to go, then okay, let's just go die with him. Yeah, certainly a pessimistic worldview, but at least courageous, a courageous pessimistic worldview. He wanted to go. So let's pause right here in the story, and because it's a great story all through John 11, and I'm not going to cover every verse. It's just a great story. Jesus does show up, and the sisters too don't understand why he waited, just like the disciples. If you'd have come right away, you could have fixed this. And like I said, just a few weeks ago in one of these studies, we talked about Jesus healing a servant, and he's not even in the same town, right? He just speaks the word and it can happen. And the sisters are kind of upset about that too, and the disciples are upset about that too. Why are we putting ourselves in harm's way here? Why don't you just say the word and make something happen, Jesus? And none of them understand it. None of them understand why Lazarus has to go through this. None of them understand totally what he's meaning when he says that he's going to wake up and that this is for God's glory. And it's worth thinking about Jesus' perspective here. And I'll be honest, when I'm in the middle of grief, I don't always share a real righteous, holy perspective. I don't. Sometimes all I can see is the pain. So I'm not trying to come at this from a holier than thou attitude. I mean, sometimes when you're in the middle of the grief and you're in the middle of the sorrow, all you can see is the pain. And when it seems like God's moving slow to fix things, and in your heart of hearts, you know that all he's got to do is say the word and everything would get better, and he's not doing that. I'm praying for help, and I don't doubt that God can do something. I just start to doubt that he will do something. And so it's worth thinking about Jesus' perspective here. Jesus rests assured in the knowledge that if Lazarus closes his eyes in this life, it's not really death, he's just fallen asleep, and he's with God, that his soul is caught up with God. I have a friend whose wife died several years ago, and I was with him once a few weeks after his wife had passed away, and somebody comes and says, hey, I'm sorry you lost your wife. And my friend says, I didn't lose her. I know exactly where she is. And Jesus seems to have that same kind of attitude here, right? That though Lazarus is going through something awful here, from our perspective, from his perspective, God has him the whole time. And Jesus never really loses sight of that. That's interesting to me, and I don't have that kind of faith all the time. It's also interesting to me that Jesus wants to go and put himself in some danger. So, and his motive cannot be that I have to be there to heal Lazarus. His motive is, I want to go comfort the sisters while they're in their mind. I want to be there at the funeral. And he goes to this awful time knowing they're going to be sad and knowing probably they're going to be upset with him. And he goes anyway. There's a real courage with Jesus. And it's an inspiring courage to me, because sometimes I can avoid conflict, or I can avoid the hard moment. What would I say? Or how I wouldn't know what to do. And Jesus never seems to let that sort of thing slow him down. Even when he knows the outcome is going to work out, he's willing to go and face the music, sort of. I think that's interesting too. And Jesus wants the disciples to see it. He wants them to see the power that he has over this whole situation. He wants to be there with them when they see what he can do. And that's how the story ends. At the very end of the story, Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb where Lazarus is laid. It's a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. And take away the stone, he says. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there's a bad odor. He's been gone. He's been dead for 4 days. So this wasn't, even when Jesus takes a couple days to delay and the time the messengers get there and the time the messengers go away, you keep in mind how long all this was. And by the time Jesus actually gets there, he's been buried for 4 days. And this was a time before modern funeral kind of practices. There would be an odor, and Jesus challenges her, Martha, who's now in charge of the family. I told you if you'd believe, you'd see the glory of God. And she does believe. Well, at least trust Jesus. So they roll away the stone, and Jesus looks up and says, Father, I thank you that you've heard me. I know you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of those standing here, that they can believe you sent me. And when he said that, he called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out, hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen, a cloth around his face. And Jesus said, take off his grave clothes, let him go. Jesus is in total control of the situation. So what's that say for us? Well, we're going to go through hard times, and we're going to get knocked around sometimes. And certainly people that we love and treasure are going to get hurt too. And sometimes we're even going to lose some people. And that's always painful. And that's always, it's devastating. But we can trust that Jesus has control. And that the souls of the ones that we love are caught up with him, so we don't really lose them at all. We know we're going to be caught up again, and we can hold in tight because of Jesus' power in that. And where it seems like maybe Jesus is going slow, maybe he's got a plan to somehow work through the grief to bring us to some deeper understanding of him. There's just a lot of lessons to pick up from a story like this. And my prayer with you as you think about it and you meditate on it, that you'll be able to draw those kinds of lessons out too.